Senator Perry, welcome to the program. The state flood plan could cost this state and taxpayers up to $54 billion. When you look at that and zoom out for a moment, where do you start on that? What's paramount? And how much do you think that lawmakers are actually going to spend when they return to Austin in January?
Yeah, the state floodplain specifically came in after Hurricane Harvey. We filed that legislation in 19 after numerous conversations of where that should go. Specifically, it became a watershed basis look at flood planning. We never had a plan in the state for flood planning, which is kind of surprising to some people. Specifically, what our flood planning before the plan was is you got a flood problem in the area, you fix it typically by moving the water off your area onto some other person, some other place. So we said that's not a good method. So we have coordinated that under a watershed planning to where all municipals and population bases are included in fixing a regional plan. So we're not just moving water on top of the others. So that's where the plan basis, working with the Corps of Engineers and some conversation I had at the federal level. So it transpired. It took us till this year to actually approve the plan formally. But since 2019, large dollars from the state and federal government have been put into process with the understanding that everything they were doing would be something that would be eligible under the state water flood plan. So we haven't spent money foolishly. We've spent money wisely. And most of that money to date has been spent on planning and engineering and right-of-ways and what is the solution. So we don't have a lot of tangible fixed assets to show for the dollars spent today. And I don't have that number off the top of my head because there was such a intermixing of federal and state dollars and then local dollars. Yeah. Houston, Texas actually approved a $2 billion bond package to fix some of their flooding. But it can go specifically to dredging out canals and reservoirs and opening more capacity to catch and keep rain. Just as simple as just having release points better served and gauges to highlight and monitor some of those raised points. But so I expect, and we're having a hearing next week, to get a full-fledged update of dollars spent. A lot of them in the Harris County region. You know that that's where the epicenter for flooding is. Every city has floods, but that's where you can anticipate probably needing it the most. So a lot of part of that Harris County coalition and all those counties surrounding that, the Hurricane Harvey County specifically, and then down in the valley areas, they will come and talk to us about the money they've received, state and federal, and where we at, and then where do we go from here? Because we just had rains this past few months ago that, again, we had flooding in areas that you would anticipate hopefully not having, but I'm understanding it did take a lot of time. Now, the state spent several $1 million on LIDAR mapping, which truly, if you ever get a chance to go to Water Development Board, pull up the flood plan, you can put in a particular area and put in what would happen if a 4-inch rain occurred here. What is the property damage and the lives that could be lost? It's very sophisticated. And the state did the backbone and the infrastructure to build the flood plan on. So
is that online for anybody to see, Senator?
I believe that anybody can access. Now, how you get there through the portal and what the sites are, but I'm sure if you typed in flood planning, Water Development Board, you're going to get the plan itself and then the LIDAR, and you can do this for water supply planning. They've got every regional planning group with what water shortages they need, how they anticipate to meet the need, and the deficit that still exists. So pretty sophisticated if people have got time and are kind of wonky, I guess, that are into that kind of conversation. It's pretty sophisticated stuff. It's been very successful in giving direction to our locals to bring back regional plannings that should prevent some flooding from occurring going forward.
This is your committee meeting next week. Is that right?
Yeah, next committee meeting. There's several things going on in the committee meeting next week. We're having an update on monitoring legislation that we passed last session, specifically the water supply funds. Secondly, we're having an update on SWIFT and TURF and TIP and some of the money funds that we put in, where we're at, how we're doing. And then from that, we're going to get an accounting. I asked after the flooding in that Santa River area, I said, I need to get an update on where all of our dollars are. I mean, we get a 10,000 foot view. Here's the funds. Here's where they are. But we haven't had any granular conversation on exactly what projects there are, where we're at. The $54 billion is a number for the fund. It will be done largely with the support of state programs that give credit leverage, zero loans, some grant matchings, but the federal match is also involved in that, and I don't have access to those numbers. So locals kind of band together and positive funding and work on those initiatives together.
Well, just so I understand it, the $54 billion price tag, considering this is the first time it's been done, I mean, that's a huge price tag. Lawmakers can't fund all of that at once. What are the priorities, and how much do you think is realistically going to be spent when you all return to Austin?
So we have a surplus and competing infrastructure conversations. One, grid. We recognize we had under capacity grid to meet the supply need today plus tomorrow. We've got a water supply conversation that hasn't gotten into the conversation in a big way yet, but I anticipate that to change over the next 2 weeks based on conversations I'm going to have and will be having. And then the flood planning has been funded. We set up funds in 2019, and we've literally been putting monies into those funds, and every year we effectively re-up. It's not 100%. There's some skin in the game on the locals because most of that is so regionally based that we don't know what they need as a state. We rely on them to tell us, and we help fund that. So every session, I think as those pots go down, money will replenish them based on what the market can handle, based on where people are at. Some of them are low interest loans, some of them are credit leverages. There's been significant amount of money spent. Most people would realize it because it hasn't materialized, like say, fixed tangible assets yet, because it's just complicated. When you're in urban areas, how you move that water and prevent a problem that you're trying to solve is pretty engineering intensive. So
yeah, it seems like it.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Senator. Just so I understand, though, do you think that? I mean, is Harris County the priority or Galveston County or Fort Bend or Montgomery as you go into the next legislative session for spending the first big chunk of change on this, or where do you think the priority is?
And I think that's where I'm at. We've spent a big chunk of change already. So most people don't realize it, but we have, as a state, committed large dollars and spent large dollars. There's not a priority to a county, but now that we've got a watershed-based approach to looking at flood, as we always should have, but never did, that encompasses multiple counties. When you're doing that planning, it requires communication, coordination between all of those flood zones and flood planning experts in the region now. So it's not just Harris County. It's going to be every county that's attached to Harris County in that watershed. So if you've got 3 watersheds, you got 3 sets of communities working on a specific solution that will not effectively, again, move water onto my neighbor to solve my problem today. So that coordination is required, and that was the backbone of Senate Bill 8 that put this plan in place.
Over what period? Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, that's something I think most people don't understand. We have multi-billion-dollar projects. Actually, Governor Abbott just approved the UTP transportation plan, $148 billion. $148 billion plan over a 10-year cycle, right? So we have multi-billion-dollar infrastructure needs specifically that we do a plan accordingly. Our water plan is built around 50-year cycles. Those are multi-billion-dollar sections. So these big projects, you're not going to get them funded, nor could there be enough vendors. If we had a $54 billion check today and we put it into the Texas economy, there's not enough vendors in the world to come into Texas to build out that infrastructure. So you kind of do the best you can with this, what you got and what the budget gives. We don't judge this budget in Texas. We don't print money. And we have a vision of how to kind of stretch those dollars. But we will, I believe, confidently can say, always put enough money in there to keep the pipelines going, because these are decade projects in some instances. So vendors need to know with certainty that they're going to get paid, not with a conversation every 2 years, but with a conversation over a 10-year period, if you will.
Senator, you know that for as long as Texas has been around along the Gulf, it's flooded for decades, for centuries. Well, why did it take Hurricane Harvey 2019 to put state attention on this? Can you hear me okay? Senator, did you lose me?
Yeah, I lost pieces of you. Basically, you're
Oh,
just asking. We've had flooding in Texas since. Uh,
yeah,
is
forever.
that a fair statement?
Yes, sir. It's flooded in Texas forever. Why was 2019 the turning point where the lawmakers said that, listen, we've got to address this?
Well, I think that the Harvey event, and to be truthful, it was a 500-year event, right? I mean, nothing had ever came in and just sat and produced 60 plus inches of rain in that short of a period of time. There was truthfully no planning in the world that would prevent the damage that a 60-inch rain in a 24-hour period or whatever it was created. There's nothing we can do to plan for that. But what we did recognize, there was a lot of things we can do to catch the 100-year plan, are those events that we know are going to be pretty regularly occurring, but they shouldn't have a detrimental effect of life or property. And so I think that's why we started doing it. And we realized that we had allowed planning for floods, no different than supply, to be left to the local only. And the lack of communication between regions and watershed was ineffective, duplicative, and very inefficient with taxpayer dollars. So the state had a role, and we have an economic interest on the Gulf, right? Refineries,
Sure.
Millions and millions of dollars a day of export activity. So we have to protect that as just a pure economic interest in Texas. So Harvey, as hopefully a 500-year event will stay that way, highlighted areas where we could make it better and more preventable, and then mitigation would be less impact if we just stepped in. So it was a horrible day. Harvey was one of those deals where it came in, kind of came out, and came in and just sat and just rained and rained and rained. So I think that it was such an odd and such a massive amount of water. We saw what the damage was, but there was nothing we could have done to prevent Harvey. But we'll be better served for the ones that we know will come pretty systemically every hurricane season. But the statewide initiative, to be clear, every county had a flood planning initiative. Some was just debris removal. In my area, and we flood one day a year. We get 20 inches of rain. I can tell you what day that was last year. And when we do, we have a large debris buildup. So how you manage debris and some of that stuff. So there was a whole lot of communication by the Water Development Board. Regional meetings, they were in my district, I bet 4 or 5 times, meeting with regional, local people on what they needed from their money. That was the second thing about the plan. It was very regional, i.e. community specific, as to what do y'all need in a flood? What can y'all tell us that would help solve flood problems? And to the Water Development Board's credit, they did a phenomenal job of working with locals to get that on the list of priorities that they could fund. So there was flood planning dollars for Lubbock, Texas.
Well, yeah, I read that all 15 regions were involved in that. Let me ask you about this other issue here, too. Can you still hear me okay, sir? Senator, can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine. Your video's kind of froze, but I hear you well.
Sorry about that. I have no idea what's going on with that. A couple last questions here for you. The state flood plan also proposes preventing future risk, and some of the ideas there are changing building standards or not allowing new buildings in flood-prone areas. That would drastically impact places like Houston, Galveston, Corpus Christi, Beaumont, Port Arthur, even down in the Rio Grande Valley. Is that something, these new building standards, something that the state might enact, do you think?
I don't know that we'll enact them. Here's the deal. You shouldn't build buildings in a known floodplain. You just shouldn't. And the governor over that's going to be lack of insurability. So at some point, you're not going to get insurance for those floodplain regions. What we found out is FEMA's designated floodplain regions have not been updated for decades. And Texas looks a lot different than it did 20 years ago even. So a lot of those areas where it's called designated as floodplains were not on the radar as far as insurability goes. Now that we've had these catastrophic events of recent, the insurance companies are taking note. So I think the state may not have to require a building codes. And, we try to leave that up to the locals as best we can. And sometimes that bites us pretty well. I can tell you there's water supply conversations about leaving some of those decisions to development. But I think that what you'll find is the insurability of developments, and homeowners in those will become the governor for not developing, because if you have a mortgage, you got to be insured. And if you're in a floodplain
Yeah.
and you can't get flood insurance, mortgage companies are going to say no. So I think there's some free market pressures that are going to have that. But the truth of the matter is, most of that Harris County flooding is in areas that have been built in for decades, if not centuries. Some of those floodplains, and unfortunately, I think even when they were built 30, 40, 50, 80 years ago, they knew there was flooding going to occur. But as development encroachment, dams are built, developments are settled, concrete's put in, it exasperates it. I don't see the state putting down a charge. You can't develop if it's X. That's more of an insurance ability stuff. And if you can't get insured, now if you want to write a check for a home and building a floodplain, that's your cost, But you're probably not going to be able to stay to the fest to rebuild it either.
Senator, how much of the state flood plan is an acknowledgement on the right that the weather is changing in this state, in this country, on this planet?
I don't, the political words, right? Climate change, global warming and stuff. Here's the deal. Our climate changes every day. It was interesting. I saw some statistic on the other day. We had cooler weather here. And I think they were predicting 30 named hurricane storms coming through this season, and we're going to get blown away and overrun. It hasn't happened, but our weather patterns change. The air streams do change. The jet streams do change. Concrete adds heat to the deal. So, yeah, we've got to consider those factors, but are those the sole purpose of why we have flooding events and why we have seasons? Patterns change. There was a time when Lubbock, Texas could be guaranteed 2 foot of snow when I moved here 40 years ago. Now we see 6 inches. But it could go back to 1.5 foot next week. It's just things change. So I'm not going to, the politics of it, I think we're wise to recognize in our water planning, both flood and supply, drought conditions, weather patterns and trends, and look over a large time period to see if they're consistent with seasonal changes in the back of the day. This short version of we look for 10-year cycles and project out that we're going to all burn up and the oceans are going to be full of fresh water. That's not realistic. You got to look back at a trend. And I think there is some warming element to that. I always ask the question, and you've seen it in the floodplain, if we want to have 100% certainty that we're protected from all of these issues that are being raised, that's not realistic. At 90% confidence to know there's a price. At 80%, there's a price. So when your solution becomes such a detriment to the working poor and the other people that are expected to pay for it, you got to weigh those cost benefits, right? We don't want to ever see life lost. And for the most part, a lot of the life lost is because people didn't do their responsible thing and get out when they were told, right? Yeah. So it's a two-edged street here. The quote, climate, I acknowledge climate's changed since me and you've been talking. It'll be warmer or colder before I leave here today because climate's changing. The long-term impact of that, it's just seasons change. Our jet stream has changed out here. It just has. In my 63 years, our weather patterns have shifted different. And it's just going to happen. That's been the evolution of time.
But let me ask you. Go ahead, sir.
We just need to consider those and plan accordingly within the responsible cost-benefit analysis.
Let me ask you about the other side of water. There are urban areas in this state, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, Houston. They don't have enough water to, maintain and sustain the current amount of growth they have. And there's been a lot of debate about when and where to put new reservoirs to sustain all this growth. What is the state doing to try to get ahead? Because this is an issue that's fast approaching these areas in the state that's not really being addressed publicly, it seems like.
Yeah, I think it's fixing to get addressed publicly based on my efforts. I mean, it's just time. It's time to have an open, honest, transparent conversation about water supply in Texas to meet the population and the industry groups. I've been in multiple cities this past week. I'm talking to large economic areas that have legitimate water supply concerns. But you said urban areas. Let me be clear. The 2 largest deficient areas planned under our state water plan was deficiency deductions in our agricultural production areas, specifically North Plains, South Plains, and Valley, that the irrigated cotton, irrigated corn, our cattle industries, our dairy industries, in our statewide water plan, there's an assumption they'll quit pulling 30% of what they were needing to pull. That's not a valid assumption. Let me give you the facts up front. Our current water plan shows that we're going to be about 7 million acre feet short by 2070. Truth of the matter is, I think you need to shorten that to probably by 2050. Addition to that, the 7 million acre feet is unrealistic because it doesn't consider growth in industry segments and people that we've had in a large way. And more importantly, there's things inside that plan that will not come to fruition. Specifically, you mentioned reservoirs. Our current statewide water plan assumes that we're going to put on 4 million acre feet of water through reservoir development, 22 reservoirs, and in the plan. And realistically, because of economic, regulatory, and political pressures, about half of those are never going to come. So we're really looking at about 1 million acre feet possible of development over the next 50 years through reservoir development. So I've taken the plan apart. I've gotten realistic. We're about 10.5 to 12 million acre feet short of where we need to be to meet Texas water needs. The good news is,
when you say 10.5 or 12 million acre feet, that sounds like a lot to me. What does that equate to?
Yeah, let me put it in perspective. We use about 13 million acre feet in Texas today. We're literally about 12 million. I'd say 10 to 12 conservatively short of where we want to be in 50 years. But that 50-year time frame is really stretching. There are areas in the state today that need a supply alternative. Here's the good news. We need 10 to 12 million acre feet. I have, through study, figured out that there's about 100 million of potential acre feet per year to develop that's not been developed. And realistically, about 50% of that, 50 million acre feet, that we can do economically. So we have 50 million acre feet available for a problem that needs 10 to 12 million acre feet, and that will take Texas into the next century, plus another century probably of water supply.
How long is it going to take to develop that, you think, Senator?
That's the problem with water. I tell people, when the grid goes out, you know it immediately, and there's an outcry, and the legislature acts. If the broadband don't work today, there's an outcry, and we fix that. Here's about water supply. It's death by 1,000 drips. And when you realize the patient is going terminal, it's 30 years from that point to fix it. We have some triage measures to patchwork it to get it to the next level when we can actually solve the full long-term problem. Texas must, and I cannot stress enough, must, in 25 legislative session, start the front loading of the funding to be recovered once water is delivered to all 254 counties. And there's 5 different supply opportunities to do that. Start next session doing that. If we don't front load the funding, these are billion-dollar projects, decades in the making, that your local jurisdictions, your taxing jurisdictions can no longer afford to do. And then they become patchwork, inefficient, duplicative, and waste of taxpayers' dollars to solve small problems when you could have solved the bigger problem.
What's that going to cost, do you think, Senator?
I'm getting it costed out as we speak. I could give you a range. It's going to be a big range. It's in the billion-dollar numbers. I would say on the low end, minimal 50, probably looking at somewhere up in that 80 range. But over a 50-year period, truthfully, $1 billion a year is a lot of money, but it's not something that, one, Texas can't start and locals can absorb if we leverage that right over time. We don't have to eat this elephant all today, but there are industry segments questioning whether we're going to have water. There are cities that are literally at 25% of capacity that are $300 million ports per day activity that we've got to address. So it's time to do that. It's like we've got a water plan. It needs to be updated to 2025.
A lot of priorities, Senator. I appreciate the conversation about water. People don't realize it enough until, like you said, it doesn't exist. And so that's an issue.
I tell people water is life. Electricity and roads are the quality of life. And what I mean by that, for the history of thousands of years, people never moved to where there was good roads. They moved to where there was water. I love my roads, and we're not going to quit funding roads. But we need to move the conversation from water funding to that road level of conversation for long-term planning so that we can approve enough money to make sure connectivity and continuity of water supply exists no different than our roads. It's an infrastructure that no one can live without. And it's
Yeah.
too expensive and too big and too precious not to get it right. So that's where my job is.
Senator, we'll stay in touch. I appreciate the time.
All right. Thank you, sir.